Hi, I'm Miss Gaby, and this is my migration story. My family is originally from Guatemala. We come from a really small town called Coyotenango, which is where most of my family still lives. Um, One of the main ways that people make their money in Coyotenango is by working at the local sugarcane factory, which is just outside of the town. And so when my family lived there, my dad was one of the workers at the factory. Um, and one day, well, actually, that's where our migration story kind of begins. One day, my dad was invited to a secret meeting. He didn't really know what the meeting was about. He just knew it was something related to work. And so he went, and it wasn't until he got there that he realized that it was all of his workers, co-workers were trying to build a union. And so there were two representatives of this company that wanted to represent the union if it was formed. And one of the things that they said was that they needed a leader to be chosen at that meeting. And at first there was this man who was elected, or whose name was put in, but not many people trusted him, and so then my dad's name was brought up. And at first my dad actually didn't want to be the leader of the union, and it took some convincing, but after people started telling him why they thought that he should be the leader, he chose to actually take that responsibility. Unfortunately, there was someone at that meeting who was kind of there to find out what the co-workers were doing, and the very next day this person went to the administration and told them of how the workers were trying to build a union, and so people started being fired right away. My dad was on that list of people who were being fired. Luckily, I guess, his boss really liked my dad. He knew that he was a hard worker, and so he tried to vouch for him to keep his job. But my dad knew that things just weren't going to be the same, and so he decided to kind of walk away from that. And it was then where he really felt responsible for all the people that had been fired. Like I said, a lot of the people, their main income was working at the factory, and so when these men were fired, all the money coming into those families was gone. So families no longer had any money for food or for clothes or for their children's schooling. So my dad felt really responsible for that. So he decided to go back to the two representatives of the union, and it was with their help that he then started to get economic support from unions internationally. And so he started getting some food and some money and anything that the workers needed who'd been laid off. It was at that time also that he started to organize protests that were happening in front of the factory, and a lot of petitions and things that would hopefully improve the working conditions for the workers at the factory. And it took a little bit of a while, but slowly things started to get better for the workers. They got better pay, they got better working hours. Also, safety conditions were a lot better. So slowly things started to improve. And the union was really close to winning winning what it was that they were trying to fight for. And that was when the factory kind of started to intimidate people, because they realized how close that they were coming to actually winning. And so for all the people, they started bribing people to leave the union, and then when that wasn't working, they started threatening people. People started dying in really random accidents, or people's lives were being threatened. And so slowly people started to actually leave the union, and it wasn't until the union was practically dissolved that my dad's life really was threatened, and that was when he kind of felt that he was being targeted, and he knew that he needed to kind of get away. And so that was the time when things started to get really dangerous for my family. And so my dad didn't feel safe anywhere, and so he would constantly be on the move. and my mother and my sisters as well. So we'd stay at a friend's house one night and then stay at another friend's another house. And so for about a month, we were just kind of going from place to place, not knowing where we were going to be next, or if everything was going to be okay, or if my dad was going to be okay. And so one day, my mother had taken me and my sister to the capital, Guatemala City, for some shopping, and some men showed up at our house with some guns, just banging on the door. And we also used to have a pet dog, and they actually killed our dog. And it wasn't until later that night when our neighbors who'd kind of witnessed these men at the house, who told my dad of the threat, that he really knew that we had to actually leave. And so it was then when he again contacted the representatives of his union, and he asked them for help. And so my dad then immediately went to the capital city and then started all of his paperwork. And my dad at first was told that my mom and my sister weren't going to be able to come with him right away, that we would actually come afterwards to meet him later. And after that threat, my dad refused, and he said that he wanted all of his family to come with him and that he would wait, because he was afraid that if he'd leave, that maybe we wouldn't be able to follow and that we'd get separated that way. And so we stayed in the city for about a month, just organizing our passports, because we didn't have any passports at that point, and just getting all the paperwork. And that was when we applied for refugee status to Canada, and we were fortunately sponsored by a church. And so within a month, we flew to Canada. We flew to Toronto, spent a night there, and then drove to Ottawa, which is where I grew up. And when we were there, we stayed for a month in a shelter where they gave us some food and some clothes, just like our bare necessities. And it wasn't until a month later that my parents were put into English classes and that I was put into school. So I was 4 at the time, so I went straight into kindergarten. And that was kind of how our life began in Canada. So that's my migration story.